Hello everyone, thank you all for coming. My name is Sade Swift and I'm a sophomore at Lang. Eugene Lang College is a place where scholarship and academic rigor meets artistic and intellectual freedom. Dr. Hook's residency at the college embodies this spirit, and we are proud to host these critical dialogues. I have the great honor and privilege of introducing this amazing panel to you who will be talking about transgression, whose booty is this? We want you to continue the conversation, so whenever you post anything, make sure you hashtag BellHooksTNS. Our first panelist is Lene Denise, known for her electric mixes of classic hip-hop, soul, funk, and deep house. DJ Lene of Wild Seed Music draws from Black social and political movements to present the dynamic range of music of the diaspora. Lene was resident DJ for Schaumburg Nights at the Schaumburg Center for Research in Black Culture and the Central Park Stakers Association. She performed in the orchestra of DJs at the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Sekou Sendiata and Days of Arts and Ideas Conference at Harlem Stage. Our second panelist is Anna Zarnik Niemeyer, who is Assistant Director and Chief of Staff at St. Norbert's College, New Cassandra Voss Center. Anna has taught and presented nationally on experimental education and communication theory as it intersects with gender and identity, facilitating a variety of initiatives from gender-based hostility in education to youth gender roles to a course on race and superheroes. Informed by her background of over 10 years constructing curricular programs for not-for-profits and her overseas community collaborations in schools, the Girl Scouts, and Boys and Girls Club. Our third panelist, Dr. Stephanie Troutman, who is a Black feminist scholar, a first-generation college student, a mother, and an activist. She received a dual PhD in education and women's studies from the Pennsylvania State University in 2011. A former public high school and middle school teacher, Stephanie currently serves as an assistant professor of Leadership and Educational Studies and Women's Studies at Appalachian State University, and is a member of the Feminist Wire Collective. Her work is committed to explorations of feminist pedagogical media literacies and Black feminist critical pedagogies. And of course, Bell Hooks, who is among the leading public intellectuals of her generation. Her writings cover a broad range of topics, including gender, race, teaching, and contemporary culture. This fall marks the 20th anniversary of the publication of Teaching to Transgression, Education as a Practice of Freedom, Dr. Hook's seminal book on educational practices. This week-long residency is an opportunity for the New School community to directly engage with Dr. Hooks and her commitment to education and learning as a place where paradise can be created. I first came across her work in 2011 when I attended an all-girls leadership program called Sadie Nash. To be honest, I felt upset because all of my life I had been oppressed and I wasn't able to name it until then. It's safe to say that Bell Hooks saved my life in more ways than one. So for that, I thank you. My appreciation for Bell Hooks' work was recognized by Professor Meredith Cruz, who teaches at Lang. She invited me to see Dr. Hooks in Puerto Rico for the National Women's Studies Association, which I'm super excited about. In her book, All About Love, New Versions, which is my personal favorite, she says, to return to love, to get the love we always wanted but never had, to have the love we want but are not prepared to give, we seek romantic relationships. We believe these relationships, more than any other, will rescue and redeem us. True love does have the power to redeem, but only if we are ready for redemption. Love saves us only if we want to be saved. This quote resonates with me because it's about self-discovery and coming to terms with what was, what is, and allowing yourself to let go. I got redemption, I got true love, and I got saved. So for that, I will forever be thankful. Thank you and enjoy.
All right. We're actually going to start just by, calling attention to the fact that some of you, this is the youngest Bell Hooks talk in terms of the crowd of people. But so some of you may not remember what an incredible shift in how we thought about the Black female body when she's got to have it raise the question, whose pussy is this? I remember I wrote an essay that when it came to my tenure hearing, they blocked out the pussy word on, I mean, think about how mundane the pussy word is now, but it was blocked out on every sheet of paper that had to do with whether or not I was worthy of academic security. So I've been thinking a lot about that shift from, I mean, it's like the pussy is old hat. And I think that the thing that's very interesting is that the question of whose pussy is this really called forth the feminist question of who owns the female body, who possesses the female body, who has rights in the female body. And I would argue that one of the reasons we've moved from the pussy to the butt, the ass, the booty, is that it flips that, so that it's no longer about who has rights in the female body, but who has access to the female body. And here is a quote from Cinderella Ate My Daughter by Peggy Orenstein. She says, "My fear for my daughter is not that she will someday act in a sexual way. It is that she will learn to act sexually against her own interests." I would read that quote again. I think it's very powerful for me. "My fear for my daughter is not that she will someday act in a sexual way. It is that she will learn to act sexually against her own interests." So, I mean, we hope to have the silly, fun, dynamic, brilliant panel here where we definitely give the booty its humor. And so are we starting with you, Lene, Denise? We're not starting with Anna.
You're telling me you're starting with me.
You were introduced as our starting lineup. You just weren't here.
Okay, so I'm coming down the line. Okay. Okay, so hello.
Feel free to stand and do whatever.
Okay. I mean, I think I'm starting from a different perspective. I think I'm coming from a different place. I am a DJ. I am a daughter of what I like to consider to be the golden era of hip hop, which I am claiming to be, and it is debatable, somewhere between 1979 and 1995. And I look significantly younger than I am, but I've been around, the block.
All right.
I'm a golden era member. And so, but in thinking about sexuality and whose booty this is, I just want to first think about and put Sardi Bartman's name in the air, because this is a discussion that's been happening around our behinds, around our asses for centuries, and literally it being a spectacle and it's sort of like a punctuation in the American imagination, so that's not a new thing. But apparently, according to Vogue magazine, the butt is a new thing, and so
because it's white now.
Right. So now that Iggy is involved with and Jennifer Lopez and Anaconda and all these things that are happening, booty is back, and twerking, booty is back on, I guess, the kind of world stage. But yeah, this is something that has been a part of the conversation of Black women's booties, and including mine, and thinking about how deeply these messages have come through, that I have even internalized a certain kind of, as a younger person, kind of trying to kind of disassociate myself from my very large ass. And though the women that in my life have loved it, and I thank them, it's been an interesting thing, because I'm like, I know somewhere I learned that my behind is actually not desirable, not by the general public, maybe by the women who love me, but not by the general public. And so I've had a really interesting relationship with that, also because I grew up in the hip hop culture where that 79, 95 period was critical to me, because I did see Black women defining themselves sexually in a different way, even thinking about the gender bender politics that existed within hip hop, whether that is, Grandmaster Flash and all these guys who were wearing feather and leather and kind of mimicking what was happening in the village, which was rooted in a lot of the kind of gay liberation politics that were happening in New York City with disco. And so, but the gender bending piece, just thinking about the Roxanne Shantays, thinking about Queen Latifah, thinking about MC Lyte, thinking about, even Lauryn Hill, thinking about Jean Grey, and that there are women that have had this really interesting line in conversation with sexuality that looks more like gender bending than performing for the global gaze. And so that's what I want to bring to that discussion, is that like there's this other conversation that's not happening, and this like century-old one around our bodies. And we know where they meet at the intersection is interesting because we can play with them based on our own identities. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's how I want to open it.
We're trying to get Miss Lene Denise to come on to the new school as a graduate student. So she is such a brilliant young woman.
Thank you.
Anna, go ahead. I wouldn't let Anna go first. It was like white girls have gone first just too much.
That's right, which is a great segue. I'm serious because I want to talk about decentering whiteness when we talk about a liberatory feminist sexuality. So, thinking about the white girl on the panel, right? So where am I from? I'm from Wisconsin, and I help run an unusual gender center in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So it's a small liberal arts Catholic college. And this center has this unusual story of a conservative white Fox News watching dad who had transformative conversations with his feminist daughter over time. And through that transformation, there came a lot of love and in that exchange. And then when she died in 2007, he said there should be a place where this kind of transformation can happen on our campus. And so in our first year, we thought what better than to honor Bell Hooks' work and thinking about transformation and transgression. And so I've got my fun little t-shirt here, the Year of Bell Hooks, which was our first year of programming, thinking about intersectionality and especially decentering whiteness at a primarily white campus. So when I talk about the booty, it's going to come from a perspective of what my students are coming to me as. So thinking about being feminist and having a liberatory or liberated sexuality, but then also thinking about how they might be using bodies of color in their own liberation, right? So, the tradition of this is thinking about interrogating imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and that's a tradition of this brilliant scholar over here, but also thinking about love as a bridge of a place of connection, so finding a starting point and a common ground. And then also doing an intentional analysis when I'm talking with my white students who are claiming the word feminist, and that might also be problematic for them, especially as they're claiming their sexuality. So the story that I have is one of my students coming up to me and saying, have you seen this video called All About That Bass? I'm really excited about it. It's Megan Trainor, and she whips out her phone and she shows me this video, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with. So there's this sort of queer aesthetic, but there's this white woman who's dancing in the middle, and then also this queer man of color who is on the sideline kind of used as a prop. And then she's saying that she, in fact, has all the right junk in all the right places, and yet she's using bodies of color as props and to establish that for her. So that's the point of entry, right? When we think about a point of entry with decentering whiteness, this is where our students who are claiming feminism are coming to us with. And so we know that this is, a long conversation about cultural appropriation, but it's kind of been a magical year of appropriation. So, many of us are mad and are observing this happening with a lot of white lady singers in mass media. So obviously Miley Cyrus at the VMAs, not only through her twerking, but of using a black booty as a prop and slapping it, right? So Taylor Swift with Shake It Off, who's literally crawling underneath a lineup of twerking asses, but then also playing off of this trope that white women or white folks can't dance, which, may or may not be true. But then also we mentioned Iggy Azalea, right? And then so she's in this video with called Booty with Jennifer Lopez. And then the New York Times did this article called Posterior. It's all about the posterior. Posterior has it, and they mention consumerism with the ass, and only a brief mention of any cultural analysis of that. So they think about it in consumerist ways, but not doing any cultural analysis. So at our center, this is where our students are coming from. So how do you address that on a primarily white campus, right? So we have folks that are coming in, and especially in the year of Bell Hooks, we looked for a philosopher that grappled with bell hooks's work and then also could talk about bodies of color. So we brought in Dr. George Yancey, who was at Duquesne University, and his talk was called Fear of Black Bodies and the Problem of Whiteness. So, you know, he talks about bell hooks' pedagogy. This is post Trayvon Martin, pre-Ferguson, that he's on campus, so last April. And our students' reactions were incredibly visceral along the spectrum. So you've got white ladies running up to him, crying and hugging him and demanding attention of him. But then you also have white students who are swearing, going back to their dorms, being pissed. And then you also have white students and students of color that are having conversations afterwards. So ultimately, it's not the job of a black professor to placate these racial anxieties that white students have, but he opened up the conversation so that people would remain what he calls unsutured, so to deal with that pain. And so this year, when we're thinking about bodies and superheroes, I think I mentioned in my bio, we're talking with scholars like Adila Funama, who's actually worked with Dr. Troutman over here, and thinking about black superheroes. So again, taking this center of black bodies that are consumed and used and often violated, and actually reestablishing them as not consumable, but actually lasting and heroic instead. And so my challenge to my students, and then my challenge in my own conversation as a white consumer, is always to think about how we have a liberatory feminist sexual politic that is not at the expense of bodies of color.
So, Stephanie, I learned analicious or what analingus? Say a lot about
She taught her
that she seemed to think that our panel was focusing on the deep sexual, the do-it sexual. Go ahead.
Well, I think in terms of the do-it sexual, I think that, you know, the way that we're hearing booty discussed and described across a variety of spaces, but one of those spaces is definitely about the practice of anal sex. And analingus, I think, is, you know, or ass eating, as people refer to it, has become part of a mainstream discourse of sexual practice that's being talked about in hip hop music and in other venues. And I think it's interesting that not that it's new in terms of a practice, especially maybe as a queer practice, but I think the fact that the conversations that I've been hearing, including a discussion on the Huffington Post Live, which was about practices around anal sex taking place in straight communities. And so there's sort of this interesting something interesting and transgressive about having this sort of queer conversation in quote-unquote straight space. And so that, I think, is new. Again, I don't think the practices or the activities are new, but I think the way in which it's being taken up in mainstream discourse as a queer practice within heteronormative sites or situations, I think that is kind of new. And I do think that there is a connection to all this discussion around the practices and some of the representational pieces that we're seeing. And so I'm thinking about, too, in terms of the way that this is racialized, if we think about whiteness, it's almost like whiteness has nowhere left to go. Mm-hmm. And so it's moved into this other territory, right? This queer territory, this black territory, like between the discussion of the practices, right, which maybe have been typically more associated with queer space, and then in trying to propagate and perpetuate the physical, actual part of, you know, having a thick ass, which, again, culturally, we know that that's something that's been associated with and come out of black culture. So it seems, again, that it's about whiteness going to this other space, and we have to ask, I mean, I'm curious as to why, right? And so I think that we, of course, too, we can't really have a conversation about popular culture and the ass and sexuality and the booty without talking about Kim. Kim Kardashian. I think that, if we go back, just walk it back a few years, we really start to see this attention around the thick booty in terms of a mainstream discussion and conversation that is connected to Kim Kardashian and her popping on the scene and her popularity. And so from there, now we've had all this other sort of, whether it is the Nicki Minaj Anaconda video, whether it's Miley Cyrus twerking, there's all of that. But even prior to these kind of representations, we started to see other kinds of consumption around the ass in terms of, this takes us back to the quote that you opened with. I was realizing probably when my daughter was about 3 or 4, so this would be 5, 6 years ago, a little more than that I couldn't find little pants for her that didn't have something written on the ass, right? So if we can really start to think about the timing of the products that we see, the representations that we see, and the conversations that are being had, we can see how, the white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal structure is very much in place around these various sites. And so when we think about the little clothing, it's like, you have to, all the little pants say cute, or even like peace with a peace sign, and it's on the ass, and it's like, well, why would the piece of ass, right? On my 5-year-old, So, I mean, just thinking about the way in which these products kind of conspire to kind of keep having us think about these things, or placing these sort of weird, these kind of disparate things into conversation. And I'm reminded too, probably it's been several years now, Tim Gunn had a fashion show where he would take regular people and do them over. And he had a black client, and he was like, these jeans just make your ass look huge. And she was like, I like that, Tim. Like that's intentional. And he was like, what? And he was the person who was working with him on the show is Veronica Webb, and she's African American. So she was explaining to Tim and breaking it down to him how, there was cultural capital in the black community around having, a big ass or a nice ass. And so it's really interesting how, again, these discourses play out across numerous spaces. And so I think that in any discussion that we're having about whether it's the practices, whether it's the appropriation, I think we probably also remember seeing the white tennis player stuff her ass and as a parody of Serena. So all of these things are happening in ways that require us to have a critical discussion about why the targeting of black women in a particular way, why the movement of queer practices into hetero space, what are those connections and how does that affect us not only sort of in our psyche but in our consumption.
When you were talking about the children, I was thinking, whose gaze? What is the child butt with the word on it? Who are we? Who is the consumer of that butt? And is that butt really, the child butt with the word, really just the kind of warning to women in general that, about youth and sagging and, this is your competition. You're competing with a child, a female child, for desirability. Does that sound really bizarre? I'm asking you. You brought it up.
I mean, I don't know that I see it as about competition and youth, although I think that there's an age component there that has to be addressed. But I see it more as, again, right, like this sort so sexy so soon, and I can't remember the author right now, but this idea that, children are not only gendered, because it used to be the concern that, we gender them from the minute they come out, but now not only that they're gendered early on, but that they're sexualized in very overt ways. And I think that there's no cultural accountability for that, but it's happening, so.
Well, in other talks here, we've talked about the traffic in black girls, and that the traffic in black girls, in girls in the U.S., starts with black girls. And I was just thinking about, in my home black community, how little girls twerking like at parties and things, was perceived as really cute.
There are videos. People post videos of their children twerking routinely on social media. So, what does that mean when there's not the accountability piece to mediate that or somehow modify or give us a place to have a discussion, critical discussion?
And also, we know very clearly then that it's for the adult gaze.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that it's not, so we start with the female body, even as a young body, as this body is positioned for someone else to gaze at it. All my life, I've been told I have an ironing board butt. Several people know what I'm talking about. So those butts get no attention, no one cares, no one sexualizes those butts. I mean, that's where the whole sort of, puff up your butt came from for people who felt like we've been shamed because we weren't feminine enough to have the booty. But now we could buy one, we could get one, we could sport one.
Victoria's Secret padded underwear.
Well, and it seems to me that the ass is more consumable, so it's more visible, and we think about moving from, in your words, the pussy to the ass. So,
It was very hard for Anna to say that.
Here I am, pussy, pussy, pussy. Okay, so, but in all seriousness, with what I was thinking about with moving from the pussy to the ass, it's it can be liberatory, but it can also be dangerous because the ass in a lot of ways is more consumable, is more visible.
And certainly at a lot of HBCs, there's been bad breakouts of HIV among black female students because people want to have anal sex without protection, and anal sex so I can still be a virgin when I get married.
Which that's a whole respectability politics conversation in and of itself around the integrity of the body and what counts as what. But
and I think it's a good jumping off point for, it may be very liberating for us as females to choose anal sex, but I think it goes back to the Peggy Orenstein quote, but not in a way in which we're choosing against ourselves. I mean, if you look at the rate of black females of all ages in HIV and unprotected anal sex as being one of the central ways that one can pass HIV and receive it, what does it mean in a sense that we're then invited to have a sexual pleasure that is tied to great risk? And I'm forgetting which movie the black guy and the black girl was supposed to be a love story. They're having the anal sex by the garbage can. I like the way movies always make it seem like it's so great. When the woman is thrust up against something hard and cold and nasty. So that I think that when we talk about a liberatory feminist sexuality, especially for younger women of all races, we have to talk about how do we have that pleasure, whatever our pleasure is, in such a way that it is not diminishing and is not against ourselves.
I mean, I think just even thinking about this in a queer context, because I feel like the conversation is largely about like the heterosexual female experience, and I think about sexuality, in these fluid terms, and thinking about anal sex not being a new thing within the queer community, and also like the straight gaze on queer culture, whatever queer culture means, because what's interesting there is outside of the academy, I'm not sure that we have a lot of access to what queer culture is. And I'm thinking very specifically about Black and Latino queer culture, which I find myself to be a student of, in which I entered that conversation about the culture through house music, and very much so in the city of, of New York, and kind of holding this very important conversation around sexual liberation, yes, but also fatal pleasure, around HIV in the 80s, post-disco, the house, house music being kind of like the genre of music that tells the story of a people that have a hidden history. And so, I just think it's really important to think about just how deep the heterosexual gaze is. And thinking about Beyonce, for example, who I happen to feel, first of all, I absolutely love her and think that she's a powerful force, and I want to say that. But I just really appreciate that she starts a song with, "Let me sit this ass on you." But I love it because, first of all, she uses her ass like a percussive instrument, you know, in the same way that I think she uses her weave. But also, all of that, like, very much so, like, you're beating a drum with that weave. Like, this is a deeply African-rooted practice. But also that Beyonce is, in my opinion, an absolute product of the Black queer experience. Whether she is J-stepping, you know, so I just think it's really...
Same thing Madonna was doing with Paris is Burning.
No, it's a little different.
Over the Vogue culture.
It's different, and I totally get that. I think it's different with Madonna and voguing and just kind of her kind of extracting the culture versus Beyonce first of all, she's a Black woman, and I do think that she has a different level of access, but she will let you know she's actually, you know, has a different kind of relationship, a public relationship with like Black queer choreographers, and makes sure that they are documented. And, you know, I just think that she has a different, more respectful relationship. But at the end of the day, she certainly is, you know, a symbol of the American music industry. And so there is exploitation there that's rooted in, you know, what it means to be an artist. But I just wanted to kind of just talk about the absence of a discussion about queer culture. Like, what is queer culture outside of queer theory discussed in the academy? So yeah, that's just a thought.
Mic drop.
Are we getting the impression that the booty is just not that interesting? I mean, I want to know, what are you all thinking out there? I feel like you've had some great analysis and thoughts up here. What's going on out there?
I just have a few things.
And this is Lamar.
A few things. I mean, you are so deep, and you're my new favorite person. It's weird. I mean, because I'm not a fan of Beyonce, but I absolutely agree that her expression is absolutely. She's a drag queen, essentially. I mean, what she is giving is drag. Gender performance. But I mean, I guess I'm concerned if we think about Belle's, you know, essay on Paris is Burning. I mean, what kind of femininity are most people reaching for? Are they reaching for that white femininity? Is that the thing that so many drag performers are, you know, or even the Diana Ross thing, which is, you know, like that kind of long-haired femininity. I mean, like, what is the femininity we're reaching for? And then this question of like, this, you know, this as within the heterosexual context. Like, I was casting a film recently where I needed to find white men who, you know, identify as male, who need to be penetrated anally in that Mapplethorpe image. I was doing sort of a homage to the Rob Mapplethorpe, A Whip and Ash from 1975. And all the people who volunteered in my casting call were all men. I don't know if I can call them heterosexual, but they're all men in relationships with women who are routinely anally penetrated by their female partners. And so, I mean, I think that when you're talking about anal sex within heterosexual context, you're not just talking about the women being penetrated. You're talking about, like, you know, women strapping on to penetrate these white men, which is a whole other, like, trippy. I mean, that to me, I mean, I think when people see that work, I always want to point out that the casting was, these men are in relationships with women who are routinely penetrated by their female partners. And so that was just another deep thing. And I think also, in terms of the queering of this conversation and moving it away from this heterosexually dominated thing, I mean, that we need to get into.
But let's also remember that a lot of queer culture is a mirroring of the heteronormative, that it is not, just to be queer is not to be transgressive.
That's right. I mean, Beyonce is not, even though she is absolutely drag queen, is not, I would say, transgressive.
Right. He's my student.
Nice.
Well, I think, too, when we're talking about, you know, going back to Beyonce, when you're talking about her opening the song with Let Me Sit This Ass on You, I think about the fact, I mean, in my head, what I see, though, is that image, and this is sort of one of the things that makes it difficult to kind of follow the thread across some different cultural spaces, right? In my head, I see that image of the chair. Do people remember this chair that was like a mannequin woman? And of course, you know, in the fine print, it said that you could order this chair in Caucasian or African American, but in the picture, it was the African American woman version of the chair with a white woman sitting on it. So So in terms of thinking about, again, race and let me sit this ass on you and what does that mean and at whose expense is, one thing being upheld or uplifted, the commodification around the body, all of that, right? I mean, these things are not, they are seemingly disconnected, but they're not disconnected, I guess, is what I'm interested in, those relationships.
And I think that it's really difficult because as Americans, I do feel like we fail at having nuanced conversations. And so the fact that all of those answers could be in a Beyonce performance, and actually I don't want to keep making this about Beyonce, I know that she occupies a lot of space, but but the nuanced conversations are just like what I crave, the complexity there, because those layers, I mean, each layer has just like hundreds of history attached to it. And so trying to have these conversations are difficult because I feel like as Americans, we are socialized to be ahistorical, apolitical, and not really deal with just a nuanced storytelling and or understanding of popular culture, especially. So that's why it's actually critical, and I'm honored to be on a panel with Dr. Hooks, because in reading books like Real to Real and reading, Whose Pussy Is This? And I learned how to have a certain kind of lens that would, I learned how to ask deeper questions and how to develop a critical analysis. So I appreciate that.
But the question that we seem to not be able to answer, I say collectively, those of us who write and think about sexuality, is what is a feminist liberatory sexuality? I mean, do we consider Beyonce, and we focus on her because she's the young person who's put the big word feminism up there for the world to see. What is this sexuality and how do we name it? And it seems to me that this continues to be somewhat of a crisis within feminist thinking, is the inability to name. What do we mean when we talk about liberatory sexuality? And one of the things that we see, and if I were critiquing Beyonce on this, is the collapse of hedonistic sexuality with the notion that it's liberating. Like, if I'm a woman and I'm sucking somebody's dick in a car and they're coming in my mouth, and we could be in one of those milk commercials or whatever, is that liberatory? Because I might be the person initiating that. Or is it really still part of the tropes of the existing imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal structure of female sexuality? Your name?
My name is Sergey Kubesa, and I don't have any answers, but I would love to add on to that question, because I think I asked a similar question last year, and I'm struggling with this idea that like I'm a sexual person. I feel like I'm admitting that. and I love that sexual part of myself, and I like to perform my sexuality, and I like it for me, but I know that I'm as a person who, I know that I'm performing within this, I don't know how to say this, in a really fucked up culture. So I'm wondering, how, yes, I like this conversation because I think it's really important, because I think, yes, I enjoy sex, I enjoy all these things, I enjoy my booty, I enjoy these things, and I am just, yes, I would like to talk about those things.
Can we look to more lesbian, black lesbian people? I just think that there is so much, I think a lot of people use of erotic, as this different kind of model. Even the way Erykah Badu seems to negotiate her sexuality in a popular sphere. And this is a very different conversation than the Beyonce thing. It's very, it's more spiritual, it's more in the deeper side, or the deeper history of black cultural production, the radical black tradition, right? That it's grabbing onto that stuff that's about jazz and about that's a different kind of model.
Well, and I think too, going to that point, it's interesting. One of the personal sort of conflicts I have around the analyses of twerking, which I think most of them are very oversimplified. Mm-hmm. And while I do find the twerking of young girls problematic in terms of whose gaze it's made for, I also think it's critical that we allow little girls to take pleasure in their body. They should be able to take pleasure in their body and in moving their body and in being in their body in very particular ways without having to know or worry about violation or thinking about how that might and I don't think little girls are thinking about those things per se when they're engaging in some of the dancing and things like that. And so it really becomes about sort of how do we create a space that's safe for them to do certain bodily practices that would otherwise not be problematic if we didn't have certain, elements of our culture that were targeting them and sexualizing them and all of that. So I think that that's a big part of it. And I also think that twerking, some of the movements and some of the rhythms do connect back to sort of African diasporic dance. And so
Absolutely.
what is it, what is that relationship? How does that inform the cultural practice as well?
But I think that's the challenge. Here we are in this imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. How, first of all, let's not even get to sex. How do we claim the body as a location of delight, pleasure, love? Because one of the things that I do find interesting when people talk about Beyonce or other people is the whole hair thing. And the fact that we can go back to the history of RuPaul. RuPaul is the first person that we're going to see that's whipping it with the long blonde hair. And to what extent does that deep affirmation of a white racist aesthetic then mediate the sexual, can we imagine Beyonce with her dreadlocks, moving the hearts and soul of all the white people who claim to be so moved? Or is it that part of what they're moved by is her own kind of, this kind of self-effacement and the abjection that is always there. Even when we see that someone like her who's so beautiful, to my mind, doesn't try we don't see her with okay, you have your blonde hair this week, but then you have your funky dreads or your funky twist, and then you really see a kind of containment of the black female body that on one hand we're being told this is a spectacle of the liberated young, because young is really crucial in this female body, because let's face it, when Tina Turner jumped all around and shook her booty, which was really never positioned as a young booty, it was always old, it was always wounded, it was always subjected to the male containment of it. How do we then, how can we separate this body, this black female body, from the imprisonment and the bondage of the imperialist gaze, the imperialist patriarchal gaze?
Well, that's part of what makes, the uniquely feminist sort of body or sexual politic is that it will always be one of dissonance. I'm thinking about what you're saying here, thinking about over here, I'm trying to make eye contact with you in your question, but thinking about both celebratory and critical, right? So that can be a unique element of the body politic, is that will always be one of dissonance because it always comes with an awareness, or at least a critique.
And I think I am interested in, I think the Dr. Hooks mentioned feminism in terms of people who are thinking and writing about it. I think I am so interested in thinking about the folks who are not writing about it, and not reading about it, but practicing it. And so, practicing it very specifically. And Angela Davis wrote an incredible book, Black Feminism and Blues Legacies. Incredible piece of information, right, where she centers black women's blues lyrics, right, transcribes them, and in the process realizes that they had been mistranscribed, up until that point, right, goes into a library and goes through hundreds of songs and realizes that women, that Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and Billie Holiday were saying all these things that were totally aligned with what she was calling black feminism, and that was very important. It's where is feminism happening outside of the academy? Where is it happening in prisons? Where is it happening in our communities, in churches, right? It is happening outside of the academy, and I just think it's important to include those voices that, and people who were possibly functionally illiterate, but who could stand, right, who could stand in a space and say, according to what your books say, I am a feminist. And so I think that's important.
I didn't find the Angela Davis book as radical as I wanted to find it, because I felt it was a kind of standard lit crit sort of read, and not a discussion of those interstices of black female sexuality. What is it to live as a man before we have the trendy transgender world that we have today, and try to articulate your voice, your sexual voice. What is your sexual voice? We've learned very little from the radical black women who have chosen in their lives to live as men about what was their sexual voice, what kind of sex did they have. And I tell you, black women writers, the straighter, the greater the silence. I mean, we know, for example, we don't know why Zora Neale Hurston never had a child.
Right.
Which I always find really fascinating. In terms of just what it is to be a writer and what kind of space that you have as a poor woman of color, poor black woman to create. Because we have had and continue to have enormous silences about our body.
Right.
And I think that how to bring those bodies out of that historical silence, and then out of the silence that, I mean, to some extent, I mean, I am not like anti-Beyonce, and I enjoy her music, but I also see her image, her representation, as a kind of silencing in its own way, because it does not allow for a reading of that history. It does not allow for an acknowledgement of, I mean, try to imagine her with some nappy dreads or some nappy hair up there swinging and dancing, and think about, would she have the money that she has in this culture? Is there a kind of blackness that isn't sellable, that isn't marketable?
So I guess in response to what you're saying is, if we conceptualize Beyonce in terms of consumption, in terms of liberation, then perhaps even whose booty is it? It's not her booty, right? It is and it isn't. If it's belonging to capitalism, or a particular gaze or a particular capitalist gaze that's connected to money.
Or is it being created by capitalism?
I feel kind of bad for bringing Beyonce into the space, because she has a way, because she's actually a powerful force, and whatever she's doing, she stays in our mouths, and she's a center of analysis for us.
Then why should you feel bad? I think
no, I don't feel bad. I'm just saying it's interesting that she's
here.
shifted.
She and I need to talk.
No, I wish she was here too. But I do want to say that you mentioned, like, and I mean, I didn't bring up, so Angela Davis especially is, as a DJ, I consider myself to be an archivist of sorts. I am an information specialist. Like, I manage thousands of songs, right? And what I want to say is, in that management of information, one thing that has been incredibly heartbreaking for me is to see who tells our stories. So for me to see Angela Davis's name connected to a story about Billy Davis, Ma Rainey, and Bessie Smith was critically important to me, in the same way that it was important that we're talking about Zora now, partially because Alice Walker went back and did, her homework and offered her resources to bring her work to us. And so I just think it's really important, especially for Black women cultural producers, that we have, the kind of relationships with the Academy, within and outside of it, where we can document our experiences, where we can document how we are contributing culturally.
I think it's so hard, because I think we all marginalized groups live within the tension of representation. But what kind of representation? Mm-hmm. And representation that perpetuates the status quo, or representation that liberates us. And I do think that, I've felt this tension throughout my work, the whole question of, if we are living in the society of where Black people are colonized in our minds, in our imaginations, then how do we create a product and sell it, or make a living with it? I was thinking, for example, about the cinematographer Arthur Jafa, who did Daughters of the Dust. Mm-hmm. And when I think about the sensual, sexual images of Black people, he did a Cassandra Wilson video with Ezok. What's Ezok's last name? He's just so fine. Nobody knows. Deborah Willis, you know Ezok's last name. Do you know that video? Because we have the powerful Miss Deborah Willis in the room.
Deborah Willis?
Done a lot to bring us different kinds of images of the Black female body and sexuality. I know there are a couple of people with their hands up, but what are you thinking?
Let's let them speak and I'll add.
Okay. You want to try to say something, your name?
I just saw that they had their hands up, and I wanted to point out that they had questions, and I don't know if you could see them. Thank you.
I actually couldn't see them, but I was going to look over this way more deeply. Your name?
We both have questions. So my name is Afia. I'm a student at NYU. I'm actually one of Professor Willis's students. So we're very excited to be here.
All right, we're excited to have you.
Beyonce is one of my favorite topics about that. I'm very happy that she came up. And I have so much to say, so I'm going to try and be quick. But just this transition, like in terms of who's telling the story, that's a lot about a personal project that I have going on and in our class. But thinking about consciousness and intention, and as we talk about what Beyonce is doing on stage or on screen and asking the question, who is behind the art that she's putting up there? And when I talk to Black girls especially who are obsessed with Beyonce or anywhere near that area, when you see little Black girls on the street and you can tell that they're trying to be like Beyonce, but they don't see that they're trying to be like Beyonce, trying to be like a white woman on television outside of her own free will. And then I think about her role in Dreamgirls when she became the lead, and it was because she was the most blank slate and she was the one that was most able to blend into all of the popular culture, essentially wiping her clean of her own and making her whatever everyone else wanted her to be, the dream girl. And so she's kind of that real life drag queen dream girl and we just were talking about Bootylicious and just so many things, and she's not even in control of it, but then the power, like these artists who are allowing themselves to be displayed this way, Black women, we were talking about this on the way here, what is that fine line of when you step in and just like pay attention to how the messages you're sending to the masses, I guess. Like in that Black woman world, can we expect Beyonce to take a step back and say, I'm this Black woman, my body is or is not my own, and this is how I'm portraying myself to the masses, to 16-year-old girls who want to be like me and will never be ... I have so much, but that's the gist of what I was thinking. Intention and how intentional Black bodies are in their head or in their action of performing all of these other works, whoever is behind the work that's being created.
And performing feminism too.
Mm-hmm.
In obvious ways.
Because she, after that set of videos and CDs, when that dropped, the word feminism came out like right after Beyonce's name so many times, and was dismissed. That's very disturbing because I don't think she raised her hand when they asked who's a feminist in the room. I think people picked out qualities and associated with her to validate the work that she was doing, to validate her crawling on the beach drunk in love, and to validate all of these other things. So
I don't think she's crawling on the beach.
She is. What is she doing on her hands and knees? I mean,
yeah.
What is she doing? I mean,
I'm sitting back here, I was gonna not say things, and I'm actually sitting here, but I just want to complicate this a little bit because people love to say like, oh, someone's controlling her. She owns everything, she manages everything, and she runs everything, and I believe this is whose booty is this. And I think too often it's easy for us to be like, oh, a Black woman must not be in control of her image, she must not be making these decisions. More complicated is she is in control of these decisions, and this is what she's choosing to do. Who's having those conversations with her? I think she came up with her lock, she came up with braids, she came up with many different hairstyles. Right now she's doing this one. The thing that is her front line right now is actually the booty and the thighs and what she's done to bring that into the public sphere, the public conversation. Whether you agree with what she's doing with it or not, I mean, I think a hair conversation, maybe that's a whole different panel, and I think it's a good panel, I think it should happen, but I feel like too often we strip women of their power as a default, like we start there. We start with like, we could not possibly have power over what we're doing. And I think a more interesting conversation is, you know, between her and Nicki Minaj and Kim Kardashian and all these different people who are out there presenting their bodies and presenting the female body in a different way, who actually has ownership, who is making the decisions, and is it more powerful for us to make those decisions and put our bodies on display or not? Was it more powerful for us to be shamed into thinking our bodies shouldn't be displayed or not? Like, are we free because we're displaying? Are we free because of who we're displaying for? Like, what actually liberates us in the process? Like, I love, as a thick woman, I have claimed the space. I'm like, you're gonna look at my ass. I'm gonna wear tight pants because I was shamed to think that you shouldn't because there's something wrong with it. Now I feel very powerful about it. Now if some
If other
Well, what
people-
helped you to feel powerful about it?
What helped me feel powerful was really some of this looking back at these liberating images from the history of being like, actually this is beautiful, and it's beautiful even though I've been socialized, right? Going and doing my own research and being like, post-socialization or in spite of that socialization or in contrast to that socialization, this is the body I have. And there was a real moment of like, I'm never gonna have that. That's not gonna be me. And so for some reason I had to be like, well, why did I get this one? And in that exploration, I found a lot of beauty in this body, and so many others have found it since then. The more I see it, the more others see it. And all these other famous women, you know, I feel like they're responding, we respond to them, and we give them something. And then we get mad that they got it from us. You know, we're like, oh, she made me happy. And now I'm mad and I want to, you know, it's like, but if there's something like, I'm like, she gives me joy. Why don't I, like, she's doing her. But if there's something else I want to do, like rock a nappy and go out there and do pop music, then I'm going to do that. You know, like, I just feel like too often people want to tear down rather than being like, look at her. She's holding her power. How's she holding that? What's my power? How am I going to go carve that space out? And that Toni Morrison thing, if there's something you don't see, how are you going to create it? You know, I feel like she's creating one thing. How do we start to create other spaces for the booty, for our hair, for everything else? So she can't do everything, and none of us can do everything. So how do we all start to hold our own?
But also, I mean, I'm always saying patriarchy has no gender. So if there's some woman, I mean, I've been talking in these past few days about how throughout much of her career, I've had a lot of admiration for Hillary Clinton. But that admiration is definitely turning to complete, I'm not into you because of your politics. So that I don't think we have to, I guess, to some extent separate control over something and the intentionality and content of what you create. Because, I mean, the reason I want us to problematize Nicki Minaj, Beyonce, is they can exercise control and make lots of money, but it doesn't necessarily equate with liberation. And I think that we definitely are, you know, come on, most of us are pretty intoxicated with money and with making money. And I really do feel strongly that even with Beyonce, even with all her talent, her looks, everything, people wouldn't be so into her if it wasn't that she was also so rich. And the fact that she's young and so wealthy, so soon, is as seductive as the booty, if not more so, because, you know, black people, there's a lot of booties out there that are glamorous and shaking it or what have you, but they're not connected to the fantasies of wealth, and that we equate so much wealth with freedom. So that, go ahead.
Well, and that was my partner who just spoke, so I'm just happy that she that's the kind of conversations that we have, though, and I just think that's important because together we were in South Africa, and what song was that?
It was,
I woke up like the...
It was,
Okay, so, Flawless, right? I had Beyonce love Shame for a long time. I also had Jay-Z love Shame, right? So, and then I ended up working with New York City youth who were involved with the criminal justice system, and then I learned that this was one of the most brilliant MCs in the game, right? And so by looking at his language and reading his rhymes as text, I learned a lot about his brilliance. But what we saw in South Africa was incredible. And it's just hard to kind of describe, like, there is a power in what happens. First of all, even with this woman's thighs, our thighs have been demonized as well. And to see, I think that she has relatively large thighs, but what she does with them is really, really incredible, in the way that it resonates in Africa, and the way that she has also even kind of brought the diaspora into the conversation is important. So I just think the control, you know, the or is just dangerous when we say that control looks like this or is control that, because it's just, again, so nuanced. But
well, I'd also, though, I guess today, you know, I am a big lover, fan of Emma Amos, black woman artist, part of the group Spiral in the 40s and the 50s. And one of the things we know is how she was the only woman in the group, black group of artists, that Romare Bearden, Norman Lewis, that the men in that group went on to much fame. And to this day, I mean, Emma's 80, the great majority of her work is hanging in her apartment. And that work is, a lot of it, black female bodies. So I also want to problematize for us, and lots of asses, about that whole question of the visual gaze. What are we willing to embrace as interesting, as fascinating? How many of you in this room have gone out and purchased some art, work of art, that exalts in the black female body? And so I think that it's interesting to think about why is it that we're willing to pay money in one arena and uphold a glorification, if we want to call it that, in one arena, but not in these other arenas where black women often work in silence, often work without receiving the reward that their work deserves. And why do those images not lift us in that Jackie Wilson way? Your love has lifted me higher. Yes. And because I'm going to be just truthful, because later on I'm going to be talking to the mighty Miss Cox. I am not lifted up by the image of her or Beyonce on the cover of the white magazines. And the way they've been dressed and the way they look, I don't look at those images and feel lifted up. Whereas when I go to the Carrie Mae Weems show and I see particularly the section on roaming in Italy, I am lifted up. I am more than lifted up. I am carried away. I move to a new dimension. And I wish for black girls and black teenage girls that those images were as accessible to them as the images of pop culture that are limited in their vibrancy and even in their beauty, because a lot of times it's just the reproduction of the same. I mean, that's one of the things that struck me about Anaconda. I was like, this shit is boring.
It was boring.
Okay,
It was boring.
I have seen it in the first couple of shots, and okay, I kept calling people, well, what does it mean?
It's boring.
Is there something that I'm missing that's happening here? Because I'm not getting it.
Let's get a recentering of the phallus too, because the anaconda.
Okay.
Right.
I mean, the original text is all about his penis, his cock, and so it's really a recentering of that.
Totally.
Yeah.
And
Well, I have to say, who's trying to speak? Yes, speak to us.
It wasn't going to answer that question.
That's okay. You can.
You were asking at the beginning, like, why is it still so difficult for us to imagine liberatory sexual politics? And I'm wondering if part of the reason, at least in black communities, is because the word liberation is so tied up with like black men's liberation. And if we get into the discussions about why there's such a silence, it might mean implicating the ways black men and black women aren't working with each other, whether we are straight or gay. And I think even though, we have like almost a knee-jerk protective reaction of black men for good reason, but I wonder if we're not having enough kitchen table discussions about that still. Like, we're doing really good in it in the academy and in, let's say, art spaces, but just in our family circles, I can even just think within my own family, our reaction is to be protective of the black men in our family, even maybe sometimes at the expense of talking about the ways that they can unconsciously be oppressive towards us. So when we think about liberation, sometimes it's like we're going through all these layers, and it's very difficult to go through a layer where we complicate our relationships across queer or straight spaces in our families.
This is a student space. Are you having these thinking about you here as students, and this is uniquely that space in the residency, are you having these conversations in your res halls, in your apartments? There's a call for it, and if so, what are your reactions to that, and how are you grappling with it?
They're watching Orange is the New Black.
Yeah, I have been.
Your name, sweetheart?
Masai. I was here yesterday. And
I know.
This question about sexual liberation versus sexual identification, and I have been on this topic for a very, very long time, and I seem to get more and more confused as I as I talk about it more, discuss it more. And I just want to know, is there a solution or is there an answer when in this patriarchal society where it's designed to please men, this idea of sexual liberation, which you yourself individually might feel and might know that it is, you are sexually liberating yourself, but the rest of society will view it as sexual objectification, and it's kind of like playing along with the design of the patriarchal society in the first place. So it's kind of like this constant cycle where is there any answer?
Well, I think that critical vigilance goes along with liberating ourselves, that we can't decolonize our mind. I mean, let's go back to AA and Narcotics Anonymous, that when you decolonize your mind, it's not like you do it once and you're there. It's a constant vigilant. I mean, like, for example, I owned for a while the Carrie Mae Weems piece that had the black woman looking into the mirror and seeing the white female, and it was like, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Not you, black bitch. Well, actually, I can tell you, I found looking at that every day ultimately very assaultive to my sense of self. Because even though I understood Carrie's sort of witty, sarcastic, all the things, the nuanced take on it, I found that as just in the dailiness of life, getting up as a black woman, seeing that as something that really felt like it depressed me in a certain way. And I was like, you know, this has to go back. And I think it's interesting that it went back to the white woman who had allowed me to have it in the first place. And I often pondered, what did she see when she looked at that? When she saw the not you black bitch. Deborah, did you have a response to that piece?
It's fascinating because I talk about that piece because the mirror is about reflecting always, and we're always rereading our images. But that image basically stopped me as well in terms of asking the question, why am I looking for validation in the mirror when I know I'm validated through the work that I'm doing? And that's something that, you know, fairy tales we believe. I mean, we grew up on fairy tales, and what we try to impact in our class is how do we retell our stories and not empower that reflective image, but power within. And that's something that it's amazing how difficult that image is to a lot of people. But also she's looking into the mirror to ask the question of the historical gaze, you know, and that's something that we have to constantly deal with, is why are we believing that historical gaze? You know, why did we believe that the 18-inch waist in Gone with the Wind was the ideal body type? You know, when we see, why do we have shame when we have a head wrap based on the fact that Hattie McDaniel wore a head wrap, and women, and Rosie the Riveter has the same head wrap, but she's empowered by that head wrap. So there's something that happens with looking at that historical gaze, not just the mirror, but just that those historical images, and then changing those stories.
Thank you for your work. Your name?
Taylor. I'm a student at the new school, and to answer Masai's question, like, or not even answer, but sort of just continue what you were saying, it's just like constantly we ask these questions, what the solution is, versus actually doing it, like versus being the change you want to see. And I come to these talks, and we have I'm in like the race inequality reading bell hooks class here, and we talk about all these issues. And my problem is we talk about it so much, but we're not. Yeah, we're educating ourselves, but we're not getting too much to the root of the problem of just doing whatever you can. You know what I mean? We're so caught up in like trying to have it all figured out. It's good to organize, but we also have to remember that if you want to see something in the media or like someone that looks like you, be that person. If you want to see someone that looks like you in a film, start creating like those type of films. That's what I just constantly,
Well, I would say too, from like a practical standpoint, like one of the practices that I've just like adopted in my sort of non-academic life, but it's to like affirm Black women affirming themselves in social media spaces, right? So like just following random, women of color on Facebook and being like, yeah, I like that. I like that you are celebrating yourself, that you're putting it out there. Like, I don't know you, but I feel like that kind of support where in spaces where we're controlling our own images and having some say-so about how that gets put into the world, the vanity question and other issues aside, I think that can be an important and empowering space and a way to sort of engage and see different kinds of beauty and affirm others in, doing them. There has to be some element of that. And I think too about, Frida Kahlo, who, inspires a lot of us, has inspired many of us in terms of, in spite of her, physical ailments and other things, she still, comes off as a very, as sexual, as desirable, as powerful in her paintings of herself and her celebration of her unique, features that were not about white beauty, right?
But that's a good point. I started my research in undergraduate school. I asked the question, and I didn't know, someone asked, how did you know not to ask the question? I asked the question, where are the Black photographers in my history books? And so, as you're saying, like, be the intervention, make the change. And I didn't think for the 30-some-odd years, I'm still doing the same project, but it's necessary because you guys have to start picking it up and is creating new texts for us. And that's something that's really important.
I think we do also, just on the level of everyday life, have to deal with what does it mean to create a subculture where we create the decolonized image, but recognize that we may not be rewarded, we may not get the money for it, because that I think is real about the things that, there's a reason all those Emma paintings hang in her house. And she's been fortunate that she had a husband who had money and that she came from a family that was moneyed, because who knows if she is painting still at 80, but would she be if she had to go work at the phone company or do whatever to sustain her art practices? Because there are a lot of older Black women artists, like here in a city like New York, that we know have been homeless, that have struggled with how can I continue to eat and to think and not be crazy, who have produced beautiful, beautiful art, and some of it which gets lost. I think that is the decolonized mind challenge, is where do you make that space in your life to create? I'm involved with a group of women, and lately everybody's been saying, oh, I don't have time to create art, I have to do this or I have to do that. I think we have to make that space in the dailiness of life. I tell them, if you have 15 minutes in the morning, have that paint ready or have that pencil ready, have whatever you need ready. Be willing to get up that hour early or whatever it takes. But let's face it too, it's a walking into your self-love to feel that that time is vital enough and that you deserve that time. And that's one of the things that Stephanie and I talk about, because she's got her 2 kids, and we see our white colleagues with their kids and how much time they spend nurturing the creativity in their young white children. We're talking about 3- and 4-year-old children, and how I often say, like, I get pissed sometimes when I see this, because I'm angry about all the little Black children that don't have someone nurturing their creativity and saying, oh, this is something you could do for yourself, or what have you. And I don't know that I see a lot of that changing particularly in people's lives who don't have economic privilege and access. So I would urge you that another thing you can do is to get to know a child that you can nurture their artistic practice. Even if you only see that child for a half hour, or if you only see that child, there's a little black girl, I only see her when her mother comes to braid my hair. But I make sure that there's something in that space that addresses her creativity, her beauty. Because we talked earlier this week about Alice Miller's enlightened witness, when the woman from Nepal, who was a member of the Untouchables, talked about how do we address when you are at the very bottom and everybody is disregarding you. And one of the things I said is that Alice Miller talked about the fact that you can save a child by being that enlightened witness. And it doesn't have to be a constant thing, but who knows what can happen in that magical moment where you recognize, give that object constancy in that moment that says that you're beautiful, you're creative, and we can do that with black children and other groups of children where we are. Pima Chodron says, start where you are. So a final question, Shay?
I love Beyonce, but I really feel that if what she's doing when she's performing in these revealing leotards or wearing her hair however, that it needs to be that she's doing it for her, to liberate her sexuality, not to, you know, be the hottest black singer on stage, because she knows what she's doing, and her impact on young women of all colors is a lot deeper than she knows how deep it is, and she needs to take responsibility for that.
Or maybe she doesn't know. I mean, I ponder what 10-year-olds really enjoy about Beyonce, and because I feel like they're probably not enjoying the same thing I'm enjoying.
I'm sorry, because before we ended, I am just curious about, and sorry to shift the conversation from Beyonce, but I'm interested in what you think about Kara Walker's commentary on black sexuality, and if you could have a piece of her work and look at it daily, and how do you think?
You don't like Kara?
I know, I don't address her work usually because I don't care for it, and I think that sometimes if you don't care for something, you can't see it appropriately.
It's an object of critique.
Yeah, and so I try very hard not to turn my critical lens. Because, for example, people will think I don't like Spike Lee because or Beyonce, or something I might turn my critical lens to. But I think Spike Lee's Four Little Girls is one of the most powerful films ever made that deals with post-traumatic stress disorder on the part of children, all of those things. But there's, like, Red Hook Summer, I would flush it down the toilet probably. I'm not even sure that many of you in this room have even seen it. So I think that part of, for us as decolonizing people, is that we have to develop a more mature critical gaze, one that doesn't get into the either or. Yeah. You either like Beyonce or you don't. Right. But that we can say there may be a dimension to a person. Like, for example, I've been really sad about the James Brown movie. One, sad that so many people I know didn't see it, but also sad at the way he's been talked about. Like, one article I read was like the biggest asshole in Hollywood. And yet, one of the things that movie did, and we'll begin to close, is if you saw the film, the little boy James Brown is kind of a mellow, not dark, not light, and he's very pretty. But in fact, the trauma of James Brown's life was that people saw him as such an ugly, black, monstrous thing, and that they never let him forget that. And that he's abandoned on so many emotional levels. So when we see James Brown, the grown man who is cruel, who is unkind, who is compulsive, who desires order, that there is a reason for that. And that kind of film, which we have to ask ourselves, whose gaze is that film for? Yeah. Because black people, now one thing we'll say about black people, we know how the color caste system works. And we know how deeply it has wounded people. but none of that comes through in that film because in a sense I actually had somebody white tell me, well, we could not have identified with an unattractive black boy. But even thinking about Orange is the New Black, if you read the book, which of course my nasty review of the book was, I could have written this book without going to prison. That's that little bad bell hooks. But
we like her too.
Thank you. But one thing she says in the book that I found fascinating is that the character, the lesbian seducer, she describes her in the book as unattractive, as wizened, as a troll, looking a bit like Eartha Kitt, but white. And I was thinking about the fact that wouldn't it have been interesting if television would have shown us what would be charismatic and captivating about such a woman, and not, in fact, re-imaging that woman as, and I do think the woman character is incredibly sexy, but she's sexy along a certain line of sexiness that many of us have been intrigued by for forever. It's Cinderella as sex goddess, or what have you. But we don't yet know how to image people who look unique and different in their own majesty and their beauty. And it does start with how we treat children, how we see them, because there are some wounds that people don't get over. I was looking at, Stephanie has is that a first edition copy of Baldwin? And there's this beautiful picture of Baldwin on the cover of that book. And I thought, when I saw it in Stephanie's office, I thought, and this is a man who felt crushed in his spirit most of his life because he saw himself as so ugly, and that sense of ugliness started within him as a child. Well, we want to thank Stephanie Browner and the New School for allowing this. I have to trip off and spend some time with Laverne Cox. Such a difficult job that I have. And I hope you will join us later on in the evening for a conversation between the two of us. Thank you.